Okay, so if the white conquest of the world was a result of white people using their advantages in economic power to get what they wanted, where did racism come from? Racism in America is the result of a combination of illusions, some of which everyone suffers from, and some of which some people have created intentionally. Everyone is naturally xenophobic. You can't trust just anyone. You have to keep track of who's in your group and who isn't in your group. So everyone learns how to recognize the people they know and to be suspicious of people they don't know. 11,000 years ago, it wasn't very difficult to keep track of who you could trust and who you couldn't. Back in those days, there weren't as many people in the world, and people couldn't move around as much because the only way anyone could get around was by walking. So most of the people you saw were the ones from your village, and you saw them every day, and you were suspicious of anyone who looked different from that. Well, the world has changed a lot since then, but our brain structure has stayed the same. There are only so many faces one person can recognize. After that, subconsciously, you start guessing who you can trust and who you can't, based on a smaller number of clues you get about a person. If you're white, and your family is white, and all your friends and neighbors are white, and everyone you know is white, it's easy to generalize and jump to the conclusion that people are supposed to be white. So then you start to believe that real people are white. So what happens if you see some people who aren't white? First of all, they're obviously not the people you know. Second, are they even real people at all? Or are they real people but there's something wrong with them? You can learn which characteristics to look for to tell if you should trust a person and which you should ignore. You can learn consciously how to do that by someone telling you about that, or you can learn that subconsciously just by seeing a lot of people like that and getting used to them being around. If you grow up in a city where you have lots of neighbors of different races, that's one way you can get used to people looking different from each other. That happens for some people, but not for everyone. If you watch Sesame Street, you can see a bunch of kids and adults of different races hanging out and having fun together. Or you can learn it from your parents or from lots of other people who do all kinds of things to try to counteract racism. Everyone is born with a brain that tries to figure out who they should trust and that recognizes clues they see about different people. So everyone is going to learn something about races. The choice we get in that is what our children are going to learn. The End of White Democracy by Joel Olson is a book about the history of race relations in America. Lots of people have written books about race in America. Professor Olson focuses on how many different ways white people have found over the years to reinforce the illusion that black people, and people of other races more generally, are inferior. Ward Churchill talks about the enslavement of Native Americans in A Brief History of Genocide, and Howard Zinn talks about it in A People's History of the United States. When the white people came to the Americas, slavery was an idea that had been around for thousands of years, and that people all over the world had thought of. The most obvious people for Europeans to enslave were the Native Americans, because they were already here. That worked well for the Spaniards on the Caribbean islands, including Christopher Columbus, who was made the first governor of the first European colony on the island that's now Haiti and the Dominican Republic in 1493. They don't tell you about that in Eurocentric history class in the US, but these two historians have each looked it up in documents that were kept by the Spanish colonists in the Caribbean. Trying to use native people for slaves on their own land on the mainlands of America didn't work as well because it was too easy for them to run away. It was much easier to keep them contained on islands. So there was a big slave trade for a long time between the colonies on the mainland and the Spanish colonies in the Caribbean. Since the Europeans wanted the land for themselves, they had to get rid of the natives somehow, and an easy way to do that was to work them to death in mines and on farms. But that still didn't solve the problem in the United States of who was going to do the slave labor. The next most obvious choice the English colonists thought of was Irish people. The Irish were serfs in the British feudal system, so they were almost slaves already. So the English colonists came up with the idea of indentured servitude. A lot of Irish people wanted to get away from the British Isles and the British feudal system. So some English colonists started paying the way for Irish people to immigrate to the colonies in exchange for the Irish people working on the English colonists' farms for 3 years with no pay. In order to make as much money as they could on the Irish people's 3 years of labor, the English colonists worked the Irish people as hard as they could. And a lot of Irish people realized the mistake they'd made, so they ran away. It was easy for them to run away too, because once they did, it was easy for them to blend in with all the other European colonists. So then, someone thought of the idea of bringing slaves from Africa. They couldn't run away because they knew the land like the Native Americans, and they couldn't blend in with the other colonists like the Irish. So the big new discovery with slavery in America was to racialize slavery, so that everyone could tell just by looking at a person whether or not they were supposed to be a slave. And race relations in the United States have been some of the worst in the world ever since then. This is where Professor Olson picks up the story. When two people live near each other and see each other often, unless they threaten each other every time they see each other, they grow to trust each other. You can find this in How the Mind Works or just about any other book about evolutionary psychology. You can even see this happen in your own neighborhood. If you have some neighbors you've seen a lot but have never talked to, you feel like you trust them more than you trust a total stranger. That's because even without having talked to them, you know something important about them that you don't know about a total stranger. You know that you've seen each other 100 times and they've never tried to kill you. That's a very valuable thing to know about a person. This trust can even develop between enemies while they're fighting each other in a war. In World War I, British and German troops were dug into their trenches facing each other across no man's land. According to the politicians, they were fighting a war against each other. But that universal law of self-preservation was in effect for each individual soldier. They faced each other in a standoff for months at a time. So a lot of them began to realize that there was no action they could take at the time that would have any effect on the outcome of the war. So in a lot of places, the enemy soldiers fell into habits like taking turns shooting each other on a regular schedule every day, so the people on the other side would know when to duck. It sounds absurd that people fighting a war against each other should do that, until you consider that the individual people realized that taking risks wasn't going to help them get what they wanted. They found that the best way for each of them to survive the war wasn't by trying to kill each other, it was by trying not to kill each other. The same kind of thing happened in the Vietnam War. You can find this in a documentary called Sir, No Sir. It started with a lot of black soldiers who realized the way the government was fighting the war in Vietnam wasn't all that different from the way the government was fighting the civil rights movement back home. So they really had nothing to gain by helping the government do to other people the same thing the government was trying to do to them. So they developed an attitude of minding their own business, and eventually a lot of North Vietnamese realized there wasn't any real need to shoot at black soldiers because they weren't a threat. Eventually, a lot of white soldiers figured this out too. They'd been drafted, and they could see the U.S. wasn't going to win the war. So once again, that universal law of self-preservation took over. Their goal wasn't to take risks to win the war. Their goal was to survive their tour of duty and go home. So when infantry squads went out to patrol the jungle, They stopped practicing seek and destroy and started practicing what they called seek and avoid. They'd walk their patrols with white cloths tied around their sleeves as a flag of truce, and if they found any North Vietnamese, they'd pretend they didn't see them and keep on walking. And a lot of Americans survived the war that way, so they accomplished their goals. Anyway, back to the early days of slavery. If people see each other regularly without threatening each other, they'll start to trust each other. That means you can't convince everyone in your country that people who haven't done anything against them deserve to be slaves their entire lives. So to make slavery a solid social institution, the white slave owners had to find a way to make the black people seem to whites like they weren't really people, and that they were a threat. There were three basic tiers in the slave society. There were the slave owners, the white workers, and the slaves. Since slavery had been racialized to keep the black people from blending in with the white people, it also kept any white people from blending in with the black people, which meant if you tried to help them, it would be easy to catch you. So at one end of this situation were the slave owners, and at the other end were the slaves, and in between were the white workers who had the choice of which side to help. So when the white workers each made the best decisions they could think of in their situation, almost all of them ended up siding with the rich people who looked like them and who wrote the laws, as opposed to siding with the people who had basically nothing. Since all the white workers always had something to gain by keeping the slaves down, the white workers were always a threat to the slaves, and the slaves struggling to try to stop the white workers from keeping them down made the slaves always a threat to the white workers. So these two groups never developed any trust for each other. Meanwhile, the laws about what black people were allowed to do compared to what white people were allowed to do were used to dehumanize the black people. When you see all the black people wearing dirty old clothes and doing the manual labor jobs, and you see all the white people wearing better clothes and doing the skilled labor and the managing jobs, it creates an illusion that the white people must be smarter than the black people. The real reason that's happening is because it's the law, but you can't see that with your eyes. Then, when parents teach their children about life, they end up teaching them that illusion. So now racism becomes part of their culture. Well, the end to slavery and the beginning of a century of sharecropping and segregation did nothing to dispel that illusion. Literal slavery was outlawed, but the white people wrote a bunch of new laws about what white people could do compared to what black people could do. Well, every culture is the way people use the ideas they know about to adapt to different living conditions. The laws that enforced different economic and political conditions on blacks than on whites created different living conditions for the two groups. So they developed different cultures in response.